We have covered jurisdiction over the subject matter, jurisdiction over the parties, and jurisdiction over the issues. Now, let us discuss jurisdiction over the res. Jurisdiction over the res, or the property in litigation. This is the power of the court over an object or thing being litigated. The court may acquire jurisdiction over the thing by actually or constructively seizing or placing it under the court's custody. Okay, so how is jurisdiction over the res acquired? Jurisdiction over the res is acquired either by the seizure of the property under legal process, whereby it is brought into actual custody of the law, or as a result of the institution of legal proceedings in which the power of the court is recognized and made effective. The service of summons or notice to the defendant is not for the purpose of vesting the court with the jurisdiction, but merely for satisfying the due process requirements. How is seizure of the property under legal process effected? The seizure of the property under legal process contemplated partakes of a writ of preliminary attachment as provided in Section 1, Rule 57 of the Rules of Court. It provides for the grounds upon which attachment may issue. Okay, at the commencement of the action or at any time before entry of judgment, a plaintiff or any proper party may have the property of the adverse party attached as security for the satisfaction of any judgment that may be recovered in certain cases, one of which is in an action against a party who does not reside and is not found in the Philippines, or on whom summons may be served by publication. So again, what is the importance of summons? It is for the purpose of complying with fair play or due process. Now, in the case of Chance Asia versus Moya, GR number 232092, December 13, 2017, the Supreme Court held that in this case, the attachment of the shares of petitioner was clearly resorted to in order to vest the trial court with the jurisdiction over the res. Although the extraterritorial service and publication of the summons was properly resorted to prior to the actual attachment of petitioner's property, jurisdiction over the action had already been acquired by the trial court upon the actual implementation of the writ of preliminary attachment. So consequently, petitioner's motion to dismiss based on the lack of jurisdiction of the trial court over its person was properly denied in view of the acquisition of jurisdiction of the RTC over the res. Correct. Now let us discuss actions quasi in rem or in rem. In actions in rem or quasi in rem, jurisdiction over the person of the defendant is not a prerequisite to confer jurisdiction on the court, provided that the court acquires jurisdiction over the res. Although, summons must be served upon the defendant in order to satisfy the due process requirements. So this is an iteration of our discussion in jurisdiction over the parties. Where the defendant is a non-resident who is not found in the Philippines and the action affects the personal status of the plaintiff, or the action relates to or the subject matter of which is property in the Philippines in which the defendant has or claims a lien or interest, or the action seeks the exclusion of the defendant from any interest in the property located in the Philippines, or the property of the defendant has been attached in the Philippines, summons may be served extraterritorially by personal service out of the country with leave of court, or by publication also with leave of court, or any other manner the court may deem sufficient. In the case of San Pedro versus Ong, GR number 177598, October 17, 2008, the Supreme Court held that given that the civil case is an action for quieting of title, settled to be quasi in rem, the RTC was not required to acquire jurisdiction over the persons of the defendants. it being sufficient for the said court to acquire jurisdiction over the subject matter of the case. By San Pedro's institution of the civil case, the RTC already acquired jurisdiction over the subject properties, the res. Therefore, the service of summons to the defendants in said case, including de la Peña, did not affect the jurisdiction of the RTC to hear and decide the case, and did not invalidate the proceedings held in the case on the basis of jurisdiction. Nonetheless, the improper service of summons on de la Peña did not void the proceedings conducted by the RTC for lack of jurisdiction. As the court has underscored in the case, in quasi in rem proceedings, the court need not acquire jurisdiction over the persons of the defendants for as long as it has acquired jurisdiction over the res. The defect in the service of summons merely infringed de la Peña's right to due process that precluded the RTC from rendering a valid judgment with respect to her personal liability. And since de la Peña's right to due process is personal and pertains to her alone, it could not be invoked by her other co-defendants in the civil case so as to escape the judgment of liability against them. But take note of the case of De Pedro versus Romasan Development Corporation, GR number 194751, November 26, 2014. In this case, the Supreme Court held that an action for annulment of certificate of title is quasi in rem. It is not an action against a person on the basis of his personal liability, but an action that subjects a person's interests over a property to a burden. The action for annulment of a certificate of title threatens petitioner's interest in the property. Petitioner is entitled to due process with respect to that interest. The court does not have competence or authority to proceed with an action for annulment of certificate of title without giving the person in whose name the certificate was issued all the opportunities to be heard. Hence, the court emphasized that regardless of the nature of the action, proper service of summons is imperative. A decision rendered without proper service of summons suffers a defect in jurisdiction. Respondent's institution of a proceeding for annulment of petitioner's certificate of title is sufficient to vest the court with jurisdiction over the res, but it is not sufficient for the court to proceed with the case with authority and competence. In the very recent case of Heirs of Morales versus Agustin, GR number 224849, June 8, 2018, the Supreme Court cited De Pedro. It held that in that case, the court clarified that to satisfy the requirements of due process, jurisdiction over the parties in rem and quasi in rem actions is required. Thus, regardless of the nature of the action, proper service of summons is imperative, and that a decision rendered without proper service of summons suffers a defect in jurisdiction. According to De Pedro, the court may acquire jurisdiction over the thing by how? By actually or constructively seizing or placing it under the court's custody. The court cited the landmark case of El Banco Español Filipino versus Palanca, where the court already ruled that jurisdiction over the property, which is the subject of the litigation, may result either from a seizure of the property under legal process, whereby it is brought into the actual custody of the law, or it may result from the institution of legal proceedings wherein, under special provisions of law, the power of the court over the property is recognized and made effective. In this case of Heirs of Morales versus Agustin, the Supreme Court held that the filing of the complaint before the RTC, which sought to partition the subject property, effectively placed the latter under the power of the court. On this front, none of the parties challenged the RTC's jurisdiction. But more than this, according to the Supreme Court, in compliance with the De Pedro case, There is, in this case, proper service of summons to the defendants. In no uncertain terms, the CA found that the heirs of Vicente Morales received summons, filed an answer, and actively participated in the trial. The heirs of Jose Morales filed their answer and admitted to the allegations in the complaint, and the heirs of Martina Morales were duly served with summons, copies of the complaint, and actively participated in the trial. To summarize the rule, even if an action is in rem or quasi in rem, jurisdiction over the parties, especially the defendant, is still required. And how is it acquired? Through the proper service of summons to satisfy the requirement of due process.